All right, guys. We will talk about Miami English. This is Craft Your Language. And I didn't think I was going to make a video today. I honestly was going to wait until I got a new mic because right now I'm just using Apple headphones and they're not the best mic for YouTube. But I was drinking coffee this morning with a couple friends and we started talking about language and I was telling them that I wanted to talk about this, and I was like, let me just make the video. Um, so there's this article from the New York Times, "Is Miami English a Dialect?" written by Patricia Mazzi, I think it is. I'll put the link in the description. And then in that article, she references this article by um, Dr. Carter, professor at Florida International University, and it's called "Linguists Have Identified a New English Dialect That's Emerging in South Florida." So we'll talk a little bit about both of those articles. This is Dr. Carter's. Um, he wrote a paper. It got published 2022 in English Worldwide Journal. So pretty cool. Pretty cool. Let's see. Let me move the slide. Okay. Um, so we'll start with the New York Times, and basically, like I said, Professor Philip Carter, Dr. Philip Carter, professor at Florida International University, argues that Miami English, he calls it, and he is on a mission to destigmatize it. So basically, more than 60 years of steady immigration from Spanish speaking countries have influenced the local English vowel system. Miami residents often speak English with Spanish vowel sounds. Um, English is influencing Spanish, but Spanish is also influencing English. And Dr. Carter basically says he thinks it should be widely accepted dialect, like the one spoken, how people speak English in New York or versus American South and such on. And then, you know, in that New York Times article, it said that uh, he says, people are really tired of being told that they're wrong and tired of being corrected. Um, and so how these linguistic differences are important for people's identity. And so they talk a little bit, or referring back to his article that I posted. So let's keep going. And so then um, we'll talk about his article now, because there's where most of what I want to talk about um, comes from. I think it's really interesting. So his article says, "We got down from the car and went inside. I made the line to pay for groceries. He made a party to celebrate his son's birthday." These phrases might sound off to the ears of most English speaking Americans. This language variety came about through sustained contact between Spanish and English speakers, particularly translate when speakers translate it directly from Spanish. Okay. Um, and so he talks about whether you're an English speaker living in Miami or or elsewhere, chances are you don't know where the words you know and use come from. And so, he talks about people have a limited number of words, usually through foods that they know where it comes from, like sriracha, croissant, as the French would say. But there's other words that are really pervasive in the English language, like pajamas from Hindi, gazelle from Arabic, via French, and tsunami from Japanese. And then he goes on, borrowed usually come from the minds and mouths of bilingual speakers who end up moving between different cultures and places, often happening due to certain events like war, colonialism, political exile, immigration, climate change, um, put speakers of different language groups into contact with another ones. All right, so over extended periods of time, decades, generation, or longer. And so he kind of goes back to 1066, um, the Norman French, led by William the Conqueror, invaded England, an event now known as the Norman Conquest. French speaking ruling class replaced the English speaking aristocracy. And for near roughly 200 years, the elites of England, including the kings, did their business in French. English never caught on with the aristocracy, but the middle class, they had to communicate. So you see this intermarrying of French words trickling down the class hierarchy and into the language. So it says during this period, more than 10,000 loan words from French entered the English language, mostly in domains where aristocracy held sway, the arts, military, medicine, law, religion. Um, and he says words that today seem basic, even fundamental to the English vocabulary were just 800 years ago borrowed from French, such as prince, government, administer, liberty, court, prayer, judge, justice, literature, music, poetry, to name a few. Um, yeah, studying French now, or anyone that has studied French, but I'm studying it now, you can definitely see that these words likely had kind of, or in English, definitely come from French. And that's why I think it's so easy to learn French for English speakers. But let's keep going. Um, and so then he talks about fast forward until today. Um, where a similar form of language contact involving Spanish and English had been going on in Miami since the end of the Cuban Revolution in 59. Um, so I think a lot of us, at least folks in the United States, know that a lot of Cubans left the island to South Florida. And he says, setting the stage for what would become one of the most important linguistic convergence in all the Americas. So I don't know about that, but interesting claim. Um, yeah. And so um, he says, most people in South Florida are bilingual. Some are more proficient in Spanish, some are more skilled in English, um, but they still navigate together. Um, and I guess folks know when to talk to whom and what language, and then when it's okay to mix them, yada, yada, yada. Um, so then his article says, this set the stage for the enduring presence of Spanish vocabulary in South Florida, as well as the emergence of some people referred to as Spanglish. You know, I think I think people in Texas definitely would say Spanglish was kind of also set here after the Mexican American War, with like Texas and like New Mexico, kind of having a lot of Spanglish going on there, but uh, pretty interesting. And then he says, Second, as people learn English, they tend to translate directly from Spanish. These translations are types of borrowing that linguists call calques. I think that's how you say it. Um, and I put the star here just because I see that a lot with even me when I was first learning Spanish. I would say like estoy frío, like is in like I'm cold, but a lot of people would tell me, no, it's like tengo frío. And so I think that's what a lot of people do. And you hear the reverse too, which like people say, I have 28 years old, and like in their mind, I know like if they were Spanish, they would be saying like tengo 28 años or something like that. But in English we say I am 28. So um, that's kind of what's going on. He gives an example of like take dandelion. This flower grows in Central Europe, and when the Germans realized they didn't have a word for it, they looked to botany books written in Latin, where it was called Dons Leonis, I think that's how you say it, or lion's tooth. The Germans borrowed that concept and named the flower Loenzahn. Um, I definitely have a German friend that could help me. A literal translation of lion's tooth. The French didn't have a word for the flower, so they too borrowed the concept of lion's tooth, calquing it as dent de lion. Um, the English also, not having a word for this flower, heard the French term without understanding it and borrowed it, adapting dent de lion into English, calling it dandelion. Okay, so he wants to. So it's kind of an example of calque. Um, and so article goes on to talk about a new lingo emerges. This is exactly the sort of thing that has been happening in Miami. And then he talks about a study that was linked above, or I'll at least put a link in the description, but I showed you a picture of his study. Um, and so I'll just read this example. For example, we found uh, people to use expressions such as get down from the car instead of get out of the car. This is based on the Spanish phrase bajar del carro, which translates from speakers outside of Miami as get out of the car. But bajar means to get down, so it makes sense that many Miamians think of exiting a car in terms of getting down and not getting out. Um, and then here's some more examples that they had. This is from the New York Times. I have to remind myself. Make the line, hacer la fila, instead of join the line. And then she recommended me this, me recomendó esto, instead of she recommended this to me. So yeah, just a few examples. And then another one, um, locals. So when he says locals, folks in Miami often say married with, as in Alex got married with Jose, based on the Spanish casarse con, literally translated as married with. They also say make a party, a literal translation of the Spanish hacer una fiesta. Um, and then they found some Semitic calques or loan translations of meaning. Um, this one I found interesting. I still get confused, honestly. Um, Even in English with meat, some people think of meat as like, I don't know, like cow and pork, but fish isn't meat, and I don't know. Kind of depends how you grew up, but in Spanish, carne, which translates as meat, can refer to both all meat or to beef, a specific kind of meat. We discover locals. He's talking about folks in South Florida. Um, Speakers saying meat to refer specifically to beef, as in, I'll have one meat empanada and two chicken empanadas. Okay. Um, and then there's phonetic calques, thanks God, a type of loan translation from gracias a Dios, is common in Miami. Um, in this case, speakers analog, analog, analogize the S sound at the end of gracias and apply it to the English form. So a little interesting there. Definitely never heard of this, but also I don't live in Miami. And then another example, throw a photo from tirar una foto as a variation of take a photo. Um, so yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. That's why I put a question mark there. Um, So this is kind of toward the end of the article, I believe. But he says language is always changing, uh, practically a truism. Most people know that Old English is radically different from modern English, or that English in London sounds different from English in New Delhi, New York City, Sydney, and Cape Town, South Africa. But rarely do we pause to think about how these changes take place or to ponder where dialects in words come from? Yeah, I think the lay person, especially with languages, don't don't really think much about it, but I definitely do always think about where words come from. Um, get down from the car, just like Dandelion is a reminder that every word and every expression have a history. Um, let's see. So that was the end of his article. Um, I mean, there's more to it, but that's kind of all I wanted to talk to about it. The New York Times uh, did talk about how Andrew Lynch, yeah, he's a doctor. He's a linguist at University of Miami. He conducted research with Dr. Carter, and I think he falls kind of on the other side about what Dr. Carter believes, saying a compelling hypothesis. And his quote is, "I'm not entirely convinced that we're there right now," as in considering it like Miami English. Like he says it is a sociolect, which I think is like a dialect used by a certain social group, I believe. So, yeah, so I think there's like people falling on like both sides. Is this an accent, a dialect? What's going on? Either way, it's pretty interesting. Um, but kind of to summarize it, I agree with this quote. We can be really rigid about the rules, but in truth, language is constantly changing, evolving, dynamic tool that we fit to our purposes. And really, that's what I was telling my friends earlier today when we were drinking coffee. It's nice to have like, I guess, a standard set so like everyone can understand you. Uh, I guess probably really good with English, like it would be great. But if you're just living in a certain community, you need, as long as you can like navigate your community with the language you have, um, that's the most important thing. And like you can go to the grocery store, buy your food, order food. If you meet people in the park in your neighborhood, that's more important to communicate with them than being understood by someone living halfway across the world. Um, so, yeah, it's pretty good read. Let me know your thoughts. I know this was a super long video. I will not uh, I'll try not to make videos so long like this, but if y'all have any other articles um, that y'all would like to hear my thoughts on, let me know. Um, but thanks for watching.